Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. In this video, I want to talk to you about code cohesion and code coupling. Let's discuss what these terms are, why they're important, and how exactly they influence your code. We'll start with a short definition. Code cohesion talks about how well those specific classes and the methods inside them present what they are about. You don't want a class that does way too many things, that is very broad in scope. You want something very specific. This goes hand in hand with the single responsibility principle from Solid. Let's take a look at an example here. I created two namespaces, one for low cohesion and one for high cohesion. And let's take a look at the classes inside them. So there's an employee class, and inside the employee class, we can see several methods. Now, this already looks weird because the employee class normally would be some sort of data object, data model, but we already see that there's something like get task IDs, there's even a repository, there's a validate email, which already is pretty confusing. Now, normally if you look at this class and you think about adding more functionality or cleaning up functionality, it would be really hard to tell how exactly it's structured and if that functionality would go in this class or maybe some other class from your code. If we now collapse this and we take a look at the high cohesion example, we split the same functionality into three this time. There is an email validator, which contains the validate method. There is a task service, which wraps around the repository and retrieves the task IDs for a specific employee. And then there is the employee, where we only have get set for birthday and get set for name, and very importantly, get ID, so we can link it with other functionality in the code. Now, this looks a lot cleaner. It is a lot more specific. You can tell if there's a new method for setting the employee social security number or anything like that. It could go in the employee class. If it's something around the tasks and retrieving or updating tasks, then you know it goes here. If it's a change you need to make in the validator, maybe there was a bug in there, you know you go to the email validator class. It's very clear and crisp where each part of the code would end up in. So now that we talked about cohesion, let's talk a bit about code coupling. Now, when we talk about code coupling, we talk about the dependencies of your classes, the layers they're dependent on, and how easy it is for you to change code without affecting a bunch of other classes in your project. In general, inversion of control is the go-to solution for this kind of code coupling problem, and the most popular way of achieving inversion of control is by implementing dependency injection. I have an example project here. It represents some sort of work item tracking system. The structure doesn't follow clean architecture or best practices. I don't want you to get stuck on that. I just structured it in a way that I found easy to walk you through it and also compare multiple solutions for the problem and how the code looks like. If we look here, we only have one controller, the backlog system controller. Just imagine some sort of Jira-like functionality, or I don't know, Azure DevOps or whatever else you might use in your company. Now, the functionality is pretty big. There are like 8, 9 methods in here. Um, the code itself isn't really important. If we look at the method, they just cover a broad list of capabilities like archiving an item, getting an item, searching, updating, things like that. And the code itself kind of touches on multiple types of services that you might use, database, logging, maybe there's some Kanban board-like service, search functionality, notifying via email and Slack, things like that. Now, even though the functionality is pretty basic and the project itself is quite simplistic, we can say that already this class has over 200 lines of code. And if you look at the class from a cohesion point of view, you could say that a class is pretty high cohesive. because there is no extra functionality outside of managing backlog items. Everything in here is around backlog items and different operations you can make on them. Now, you could argue that some of the functionality could sit outside, like say the search service, but it doesn't really change much the outcome of this class. From a dependency point of view, we can see everything looks pretty good as well, right? We have everything injected via interfaces. We're using constructor injection. Everything is at the top as members so that all the methods can access them. There is nothing hard-coded, the repository, nothing like that. Everything looks pretty good. So you could say the code is okay. However, there is quite a big number of dependencies. And even though the usings aren't really big because of the way the project is structured, you can imagine that there could be a lot of other usings in here because everything is stuffed in the controller. And this is normally called a fat controller where you kind of get a lot of functionality in it versus a slim controller where, or a thin controller where everything is kind of moved outside. And the way you usually do that is by introducing a new abstraction layer. So in this specific example, let's take a look at my second approach at this backlog system, which is relying on MediatR. So for MediatR, you just go to NuGet and you add the MediatR library. And then in your startup or program CS, you add MediatR and you use this nice function that goes and fetches all the implementations for you from the assembly. If you look at the controller, there is only one method that I changed here beforehand, which is getItems, which now looks like this. So the idea is you rely on MediatR, which is dependency injected, and then you send it a command. MediatR is going to execute and return you the result. Let's see how that works. So I have this functionality folder here where I have the backlog and I have the getItems. So inside getItems, you get a command and you get a handler. Now the command normally wraps around the parameters of your API method. In this case, getItems doesn't have anything, so if we look at it, there are no members. It does have to extend iRequest, and this has to be the result of your operation. So you kind of say this command will return this type of object. And then you have the getItems handler. The getItems handler is the one that actually executes the logic, and it is a iRequest handler where you pass it the command and again the output of the logic. You need dependency injection to inject all the services that you're going to require, and the handle method, which is actually what is getting executed when you send something to MediatR and expect the result. Now, let's go ahead and rewrite a couple more of these functions just to see how exactly you do that with MediatR. So first of all, we will create a new folder. Let's call it getItem. And in getItem, we want to add a new class, getItem command. We already know that for getItem, we will, oh, we already know that for getItem command, we will use iRequest interface and we will return a backlog item, DTO. Typo. Okay, now we will expect the ID in here. Okay, and if now we go and create new class, we will have getItem handler.cs. And this one will implement iRequest handler, and it will have getItem command, and again backlog item BTO. Let's implement the interface. And now let's move the code. So if we go here, we have get item, cut the code. Okay, we're using await, so let's mark this as a sync. Now, we're missing the interfaces and the dependencies. So let's add them. IMapper, IDB service, site service, and looks like this is it. Now this is a really nice feature in Visual Studio because you can just tell it to create the fields for you and assign the values. Bam. So now all of them are resolved. Now for the ID, let's cheat a bit. Let's just short circuit this and just request.id. It's easier like this. Sorry. Now, not found. There's an option here. So the handle needs to also work for IDs that maybe are not in the system anymore or anything like that. So you want to be able to return not found. However, the not found method here is actually a shortcut that only exists in API controllers. So now we need to somehow return something from this handle that tells the controller that it should return not found. And normally, the easy option would be to just do return null, but I really hate nulls. So I want to show you a different approach in this specific scenario. Let's start by changing the return type to an actual tuple. And we will do something like this, where we will basically return a tuple with a bool that tells us if the item exists and the item itself, which now has to be nullable because we'll need some sort of value for it. This means in here, I'll be able to say this false. And instead of null, you can actually avoid the keyword completely just by using default. This has been in .NET for a really long time in C#. Usually you do default and say backlog item DTO. But now you don't have to. It's going to automatically figure out which class you talk about and default it. So if this was string, it would be default for string. And in here, the result is going to be true and API result. Okay. Now we can see there's an error here because we changed the return type. So now we need to put it here, and we also need to put it in the item command. Okay, so the handler is compiling now. Let's see what that means for a controller. So get item, you would normally do await mediator.send new get item command. Need to fix the using. Okay, and we want to set the ID to ID. And we get rid of this, and this should be it. However, we get an error. Cannot implicitly convert because this expects you to return a backlog item DTO, and you're not. You're returning that tuple. So what you would do, the easy way, is to just var result. If result.exists, then return OK. Otherwise, return not found. And this works. I'm not saying no, but I like a different approach. I really like pattern matching, so let's do it with pattern matching. So actually, let me just undo this and just do this again. Okay, and we don't need this. Okay, so we get the tuple, and now we want to switch on what the tuple matches, on what patterns it matches. And you can do it like this. You can say, well, if my tuple matches true, and then I want to save the second object as a item variable, and I want to return OK for that item. That is so I can access the second object here. And otherwise, false, and whatever it is, we know it's going to be a null, but we don't really care. Then I want to return not found. So now you get the exact same functionality without ever saying null, without having ifs and else, and ifs and else's. And it's a lot cleaner to read because it's basically just patterns. It's either this or this. Okay, so we did get item. Let's do the same for archive item. Again, we'll add a new folder. We'll add new class. Okay, and I request, and we know it's going to be backlog item DTO. Okay, same as before, public void ID. Okay, now new class, archive item handler. And archive item command with a backlog item DTO. Actually, let's leave that in. Okay, let's implement the interface. Okay, this is going to be a sync for sure. And let's move the code. Sorry about that. I have a new keyboard and it's really hard to hit the right keys. So same as before, let's do this and cheat a bit. And again, the dependencies. So mapper. That's what we're using. DB service. Inside service. Got the comma. Board service. Search service. And I think these are it. So let's generate the fields now. Okay, and yeah, and just like before, we need to do the tuple. So we're going to return false and default. And here we're going to return true, API result. And here we're going to say bool exists, backlog item DDO, nullable item. We copy this, place it here, go here, replace it here. Okay, so we have this, no errors, everything looks nice. And because we know we already did the tuple thing, we will need the same exact logic here. So let's just copy this. The only difference is here we have an archive item command and the using. Okay, nice. Now I'd like to make one note. You'll notice that even for get, I'm doing command. Now the normal practice is to use query. I just wanted to avoid that now. It doesn't really matter for this scenario if it's a command or a query. You just have an instruction and you send it to MediatR to execute it via a handler. So don't focus too much on that. Now, There are a few more methods. One, two, three, four. So I don't want to bore you. I will go ahead and do them, and I will fast forward through these so we can look at the end result together. Okay, so we managed to go through all the classes and all the methods, sorry, and update them. They look very similar one to the other. Let's take a look at the class end to end. So we already see that just by changing the methods, we're down to only 100 lines of code. This isn't a target or anything, but it does make it a lot easier to navigate inside the class. Now, if we scroll at the top, these members aren't actually used. So except for MediatR, we should be able to just remove all the dependencies. And if we do this, and we clean all these dependencies here, the class is a lot cleaner, right? Everything moved away. We just rely on MediatR. We send these commands and we handle the outcome. Now, let's take a look at the handlers and commands themselves. Let's take, I don't know, search items. So search item command, I request has the whatever you're sending in the input, and search items handler has the dependencies. What's the advantage of this is if you look at different handlers, you'll notice each have different dependencies. They might overlap quite a lot because they rely on the same services, but the dependencies are really their own. So this means that we, instead of having one class, the controller that has absolutely all the dependencies, all the methods would need, we now have them split around. Now, it's a lot easier to debug this. The handler is entire, the code for it is entirely in this class. You don't get in any way distracted by any other methods inside the controller. However, I want to make some changes to this and I want to then discuss some downsides of it. So first of all, if we go back to search items command, I've done something here. I marked it as nullable. And the reason for that is if I take it out, Visual Studio is going to complain that, well, if this is not nullable, then give me a value for it. And we can't really give it a default value because we don't know what that value would be. So there are two approaches to that. One is you could look at relying on record. So you could say record search item command, and inside a record you can say like this. And this means that this is no longer nullable because we guarantee that whenever we build a search item command, we will be passing a backlog item query. Now, if I go to the handler, this means in here, backlog item query can never be null. So this means I don't need to tell C# it's not going to be null. It already knows if I remove the exclamation mark operator, it's not going to care. And if we go back to our system controller, in here it says that, look, when you build it, you need to pass it. So now we need to pass it like this. And with minimal changes, we got rid of that weird thing. Now, I want to make another change, which is, I said it doesn't really matter, it's a command. Let's make it a query just so it's cleaner. Okay, so now it's a search item query. Let's do the same for get items. Get items is a command. That's not true. It's actually a query. And this one, the same, actually, a query. Now let's rename the files themselves. Now, the rest of them aren't really queries because they're actually actions you do on your objects. So that's fine. Going back to the system controller, now we have this clean. And we should do the same for the other ones. So in here, this is nullable. So we should instead say record. And we want to pass this. My bad. And this. Okay. And in here, we no longer need the bang. Where's the bang? Here. And this is nullable anyway. It's like I missed something. Oh, I still made it nullable here. Okay. So that's it. Update item command. This one's nullable. Not anymore. Put the good here. Now, an alternative to that would have been just to create a constructor. That's always an option. I just like the records. So again, update backlog item. Do we need the bank here? No. And ID, no. Okay. Data signing, again, annoyingly nullable. Okay. Paste this here, delete this, and make it a record. Okay, and search item query, we change this. Get items, nothing. Get item, nothing. Create item. Sorry, command. This is nullable. Let's make it not nullable. And then we'll go and update our controller. Okay, looks like all of them are like that. So now if I go in here, I can just use parentheses and that. Almost there. And I think this was the last one. Let's see. Oh, it's the other way around. Okay, so now if we try to build it, it'll just fine. Okay, now what's the downside to this? Well, the code looks clean. It's really easy to follow, and the number of dependencies went way down. I don't like the fact that it's an additional abstraction, but let's not get into that. What in general bothers me is this, the usings, because as you're adding more and more functionality, you'll be adding more commands or queries, and if you structure them in subfolders, then you will end up with a pretty long list of usings. It's not it's not something horrible. You could use global usings and put it in there, though I don't really like the approach. So that's one downside to it. Now, I have another project here that tries to tackle the problem of code structure a bit and while still looking at code decoupling and looking at um, where readability and where those classes are. So let's close the MediatR project. And I have another one here called partials. Now, in this one, there is no mediator. And if I look in controllers, I created two folders. And let's start with first approach for partials. Now, the reason I called it partial is that it relies a lot on the idea of partial classes. Now, these became pretty popular with source generators. So when Microsoft added source generators, they heavily rely on partial classes because they add extra files in your project that extend the classes without modifying them. So you have your own code in your own class marked as partial, and the source generator is going to create another file, same class, marked as partial, but adds the code in there. And you usually use that for different kind of functionalities like build time automapper or even build time registration of mediator mappings. Like there's a lot of functionality that you can do at build time so that at runtime you don't need to use reflection to figure out um, different classes that you need or how they're implemented and things like that. So what I did here is if you look, get item, archive item, but there's no get items. Looking here, get items method is gone. And the reason for that, if you look on the left side, is I created a get items folder where I created another backlog system controller. It's a partial class. This time, there's no base, there are no attributes. All you're doing is you're moving out the code. So you keep the same method as before. You keep the attributes for the route if you need them. The code is the same. The only difference that this method has from the previous ones, and that's just because I find it more interesting, is instead of relying on these dependencies at the top, which are members in the controller class, I decided to rely on local dependencies injected in the method. So in C Sharp, you can use this from services attribute that tells the ASP.NET middleware to send you the dependencies when it calls the method. And this works pretty well and it allows me to get rid of local dependencies in the class. So you could do the same even for the first project that I showed. The problem is it would get very messy if in one class here you go to all the method and you start adding their own dependencies in there. However, here, because we're separating out methods, this makes it pretty clear, pretty clean. So let's go ahead and do the same for the rest of the methods and see where we're at. So let's create a new folder, the item, add the backlog system controller, yes class, and we take get item, cut it, and put it here. Now, we need to mark the class as partial. And another thing to note is we need to take out the folder name because one limitation of partial classes is that all the pieces of the partial class need to be in the same namespace. So you need to do this. Now, we need to fix the using. Okay, that looks good. However, we didn't yet fix the dependencies. So from services, db db service, sir. Oh, got a typo. db service and the mapper and the inside service. Okay, and we remove the underscores. Okay, so we moved one more. And as you can see, it does make it readable, right? Everything is here. Same advantage as MediatR. You can debug only this method. Let's go ahead and do another one. Let's do the archive one. So we cut it from here. Oh, okay. And here I have a lot more dependencies. So db service. And the mapper. Okay, and if we remove the underscores, we are done. Okay, few more to go. So let's do search now. Oh, and I think I just realized we didn't add from services everywhere, did we? No, we did not. So okay, back to R. So I search service and I insights service, I mapper and from services from services. We can remove the underscores. Okay, now I'm gonna go through the rest, but you don't have to be here, so I just press 4 for these. Okay, so now that we moved everything out of here, this means we can start removing the dependencies that are here as members. So let's take this out, and we don't really need the constructor either. So now the controller class just became a shell. It defines the controller, it defines the base route, and it defines that we are talking about a controller. But any logic that exists inside these methods. So if we want to debug update priority, we have everything here. Now, two things I don't like about this approach. One of them is you kind of end up with a lot of these backlog system controller classes, one in each folder, and you name them like this because by default it's going to it's going to autocomplete the file with public class backlog system controller. So it's going to be the name of the file. So since we want to do partials for everything, it's a lot easier to name it the same. Plus, sometimes, depending on your project settings, might complain that the file doesn't really match the class name. So you end up with a lot of weird classes, which makes it a bit weird if you want to, for example, start searching because you're going to type backlog system controller, and there you go, you got a lot of them. Now, it's still easy to see which is which, so you know, it's not easy, but it's clunky. Another thing I don't like is that by default, because these are folders, the namespace it creates is always going to end with the folder name. So it's always going to append backlog.archive item. And this means you need to keep remembering to delete it. Otherwise, it's going to complain that it doesn't really find anything because it thinks it's a completely different partial class. So you might end up with problems here. And um, what what alternative I have to that is, and actually, sorry, there's also the problem of these um, these parameters, these arguments, because it kind of gets stuffy. So there's no easy solution to this. It is a way to decouple your methods from your classes so that they're independent. It would also allow you to make these methods static. So you could consider taking the entire piece of code, making it a static method. Uh, you pass it the arguments, and then the controller can call it the arguments. But that's a completely different story. So now let's look at the secondary approach to this. So we also have here backlog subclass. In backlog subclass, I have the same thing. I have a backlog system controller. The difference though is if you look at any of the other controllers, they don't have the expand icon like I do here. So let's see how we did that. So when you open backlog system controller and you do this, you see there 3 files underneath it. Now, this is the same pattern as before. I went ahead and cleaned it up a bit just to showcase the idea, but what we're doing here is relying on a capability from Visual Studio where it groups together files that have a naming pattern that matches something like class name dot suffix dot extension. So if I have here backlog system controller.cs and I create a new class that has dot archive item.cs in it, then by default Visual Studio is going to show it underneath. Now these files actually don't exist in subfolders, so if I look at the file itself, we can see that they're all at the same level, which is pretty nice. And it follows the same idea. You have the same from services, have the same partial, but it has some advantages. One is from a project perspective, when you look at it, it looks like one class. So the purpose of it is clearer. Even though underneath I have multiple classes, what I'm saying is they all come together to form this backlog system controller. It also means that if I create a new class, I don't have to bother with renaming, creating folders, or even updating the namespace. And let's see why. So if I go to the folder and I say new class, I call it backlog system controller dot update item.cs. When I create it, the class name matches the class from the beginning, so it ignores the update item. The namespace doesn't include anything, any reference to update item, any reference to a subfolder. They all show as if they're at the same level. So this is just a nice display functionality from Visual Studio. Now, it already tells me that I need to add partial here because it's clear being in the same namespace and having the same name that I'm talking about the same class. It kind of forces me to add partial here and errors out otherwise, which makes it a lot easier to manage. It also means that if, say, I don't use Visual Studio and I use a different editor that doesn't come with this functionality, all is going to happen is that it's going to display them side by side. And another interesting thing that I found is if I go here and let's say I do a typo, I say backlog system controller, and let's say I forget an L, uh, whatever, doesn't matter. Search item, that's the one we already had. CS, puts it at the top, but if you go and rename, it actually automatically moves it here. It kind of fixes it for you. Okay, this is the end of my video. Thank you for being with me. I hope I showed you some interesting capabilities of Visual Studio when it comes to organizing your code and trying to solve the problem of code navigation, code coupling, and dependency management in a way that kind of makes sense for your projects. Mediator is always a good solution, but depending on the projects you have and depending on how you can align it with your team, you might be able to avoid an additional abstraction layer just by benefiting of the features that the IDE has to give you and just organizing it.